Well, I invite everyone to take a chair. I think there's maybe one or two available still. I'm Nina Shea. I direct the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute. I'd like to welcome everyone here to the Hudson Institute. It is my great honor to be hosting this event today, co-hosting it with the Vietnam Committee on Human Rights. And I'm very honored to be with its founder and director, Vo Van Ai, whom you all know. Vo Van Ai and the vice chair, Penelope Faulkner, and I go back about 30 years when I first founded the Center for Religious Freedom here in Washington and started reporting on the terrible situation regarding religious persecution in Vietnam. And on about 10 years ago, I was a commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and had a meeting with a high-level Vietnamese government official. And when we sat down to talk about our issues, he said to me, "You know, you're American, and we understand that religious freedom is really important to you. And that's why we agreed to meet with the commission." Unfortunately, I'm not sure Vietnam could say the same thing today, based on the fact that President Obama went to Vietnam in May and pledged to lift the lethal arms embargo for the first time since the Vietnam War without gaining any concessions of significance on religious freedom. USERF will be represented today. We have several speakers, two speakers. In fact, all our speakers who are from the United States have some connection, have been either commissioners like myself or worked on USERF. So we're eager to have a really substantive discussion on the religious freedom problems. This is an extremely timely event in the sense that not only is the relationship with the United States becoming closer, but with fewer demands on religious freedom, but within the next month, we expect to see a new religious law in Vietnam, and that is important to debate now as well. USERF has, I wanted to say that that USERF also has a special connection here because Father Lee Van Nguyen was arrested after giving testimony to USERF, and he has spent decades in prison. What he said to USERF was that lay people and religious leaders were being persecuted for organizing choirs, for running catechism classes, and for taking other initiatives regarding their faith. So without further ado, I would like to just again stress how important the importance I place and many others in Washington, even if they're not in the White House at this time, place on religious freedom and religious persecution in Vietnam. I would like to introduce for our viewers, I know you all know Vo Van Ai, but this event today is going to be live streamed on the internet. And so we have some press in the room. So for the outside audience, I'd like to introduce Vo Van Ai and call him to the front because he will be giving our opening remarks today. Vo Van Ai is an unparalleled human rights defender, a writer and poet. He has written over 20 books on poetry and philosophy. He was first arrested at age 11 years old as part of the resistance movement for independence of Vietnam. And since 1964, so he's been involved in pro-democracy issues, pro-freedom issues his entire life. In 1964, he has worked actively in the nonviolent Buddhist movement for democracy and peace. In 1975, he started documenting the human rights abuses of the communist regime and drew up the first comprehensive, at that time, religious re-education, the first comprehensive re-education camps, started mapping them and found that there were about 800,000 prisoners at that time. In fact, there was even more. There were about 2 million eventually released, but the world had no idea that it was even as high as 800,000. He was the first to start documenting that. He also, in 78, first helped launch the first rescue ship for the Vietnam boat people who were fleeing at that time for freedom in the South China Seas. He's testified before the UN, the US Congress, and EU Parliament. And of course, he is the founder of the Vietnam Human Rights Committee. So please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Nina Shea, to present me to the audience. Distinguished West, dear friends, and for my compatriot, may I say, kính chào chư tôn đức, quý đồng bào và đồng hương. I am very happy to welcome you to this extraordinary conference today. For me, it really is an extraordinary event. Firstly, because it is held in this wonderful building, thanks to the co-sponsorship of the Hudson Institute, Center for Religious Freedom, and its director, Nina Shea. Secondly, because we have two extraordinary panels. We have a top-level diplomat and scholar, such as Elliot Abrams, Commissioner Christina Arriaga, and Nina Shea. And we have an expert and direct victim of persecution from religious communities in Vietnam. And you, our participants, are also extraordinary, for many of you have traveled very far, from Canada, California, Texas, even Hawaii, to be here today. Many have come at your own cost, and in many cases, I know, with great sacrifice. I'm very moved by this gesture of solidarity, and I thank you once and all. The presence of two of our speakers has a deep personal meaning for me. For our paths have crossed often in the combat for democracy, religious freedom, and human rights. They are Mr. Elliot Abrams and Ms. Nina Shea. In 1985, Elliot Abrams was the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights. It was the 10th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, while the communist government was staging huge celebration in Vietnam. I decided to celebrate by my own way by filing a complaint at the United Nations against Vietnam for gross violation of human rights. The complaint was a 500-page indictment of the regime repression, with the very first map of re-education camp in which over 2 million people were detained. Elliot Abrams supported our complaint and helped us break the silence on Vietnam. At the time when the American media was not ready to admit that the Vietnam War was not over. Indeed, 10 years after the withdrawal of U.S. troops, Hanoi communists were still at war against the people of Vietnam. Nina Shea was the head of the Pupla Institute here in Washington when we first met. In the early 80s, when it was politically incorrect to criticize a communist state such as China and Vietnam, Nina was among the very first to document and denounce a systematic religious persecution in these two countries. Nina is a Roman Catholic, but her work has always been ecumenical, and she campaigned tirelessly to defend the right to religious freedom for all. I am a Buddhist, and I was very moved to read her description of Buddhism in Vietnam, as I quote, "A faith that decade and even century of repression, of repressive policy have not been able to crush." Both Elliot and Nina played a vital role in making religious freedom a component of U.S. foreign policy. With the adoption of the International Religious Freedom Act in 1998, inspired by this landmark law, the European Union has adopted guidelines for the protection and the promotion of religious freedom, and recently appointed a special envoy for freedom of religion and belief outside the EU. Yet while the democracy are crafting policy to advance religious freedom, Vietnam is using the law to prevent rather than protect this right. Very soon Vietnam will adopt a new law on religion and belief, which will legalize state interference into religious affairs and a draconian system of registration and control. Organizations such as the Unified Buddhist Church of Vietnam, Montagnard Christian, or Khmer Krom Buddhists, who cannot or choose not to register with the state, will be virtually outlawed. This contradicts the very principle of religious freedom. For the Heiner Bielefeld, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom on Religion or Belief said, registration should be an offer by the state, but not a compulsory legal requirement. Religious freedom, both as a human right and a vector of regional and global security, is the theme of our conference today. I believe, and I will conclude my remark with this belief that has inspired me for the past 40 years, that the right to religious freedom is widely misunderstood. That the right to religious freedom is widely misunderstood. It is wrongly perceived as a right that concerns only those who believe in God. In fact, the United Nations definition is much wider, and it concerns us all. Freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and belief is truly the mother of all freedoms, for it is the very core of one's identity. It shapes by every aspect of your thinking and acting, who you are, how you behave within society. Here today, we will explore the way to promote and protect this right, to develop a civic culture of tolerance and compassion, and help lay the foundation of a lasting peace in this region and in the world. On this ambitious note, I thank you all again and hand the floor to Nina Shea, who will moderate the first panel today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. Many of you have come very far, long distances from across the country. And of course, Vovanai and Penelope have come from Paris to be here today. So it's my honor now to introduce our two main speakers, both distinguished champions throughout their entire adult careers of human rights, religious freedom, and democracy. I'm going to introduce them together because I will then hand over the podium to them to make their presentations. It will then be followed by a Q&A. We'll have some comments from a USURF researcher, expert who has just been in Vietnam, and then we'll launch into a question and answer session in which there'll be a microphone passed around, and I ask you to wait to speak in the microphone and identify yourselves. So our first speaker is Elliot Abrams. And I first came to know Elliot as when he was Assistant Secretary for Human Rights in the U.S. State Department in the Reagan administration. He then went on to be National Security Advisor, Deputy Advisor on global democracy strategy for George W. Bush. And I got to know him better working with him as a fellow commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. He is now a fellow in the Council on Foreign Relations and teaches foreign policy at Georgetown University. And so he will speak first, and then he will be followed by Christina Arriaga. Christina Arriaga joined the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty back in 1995. And that's when I first met her. And she is now the executive director of the fund, which focuses on protecting and defending religious freedom in the courts in the United States. She is also has been an advisor to the U.S. delegation to the UN Human Rights Commission, and she was appointed to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And in this year, she was appointed by House Speaker Paul Ryan as a commissioner on USURF. So welcome to Elliot and Kristina. And Elliot, would you like to come to the podium and start it off?
Sure, thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Nina. It's a pleasure to be here, and a great pleasure to see my old friend Vovanai, whom I first met more than 30 years ago. I think we should start by asking, why is religious freedom important in Vietnam or anywhere else? The usual answer, and Vovanai mentioned this, the usual answer is that freedom of conscience or religion, freedom of thought, is the foundation for all other freedoms. Freedom of speech or assembly, for example, or political freedom more generally. I think that's true. But there is another answer I would offer. What the question of religious freedom illuminates for us is the way in which any government sees itself and the people of the country. A regime that does not permit freedom of thought and belief and worship is one that sees the inhabitants of the country not as citizens, but as suppliers of labor, to use the old term as the proletariat. It sees them as cogs in the machinery, as automatons whose job is to work, to rally when assembled, and to shout praises of the regime when required. Thought, free thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion would get in the way of all that. In communist systems, individuals have no rights. Only the party has rights. Recall the words of Trotsky to the 13th Party Congress in 1924. This is in, of course, Russia. The party, in the last analysis, is always right, because the party is the single historic instrument given to the proletariat for the solution of its fundamental problems. I know that one must not be right against the party. One can be right only with the party and through the party. So, of course, only the party is permitted to think. To hold beliefs outside those of the party, to believe that there is a cause or a value or a being above the party, is a crime. President Bush, George W. Bush, used to try to explain to Hu Jintao, the head of the Chinese Communist Party then, that the Chinese Communist Party's fear of religion was wrong because it was impractical and damaging to the nation. He argued to Hu Jintao that any great country has many social problems, and that religious groups address these in more successful and less expensive ways than did the government. He pointed to the tens of thousands of hospitals, schools, orphanages, old folks' homes, all the other services provided by religious groups in the United States. Your society will be safer and richer if you allow religious groups to act freely, Bush argued. And they will not engage in political activity. They will not form a political party and seek power. Of course, that was true. Chinese society would be richer. But in a way, Hu was right in thinking that this was dangerous to him. Even knowing that religious groups would never act politically or seek power. Why? Because religious groups see the individual and his or her freedom and happiness and the community and its free and harmonious functioning as the main goals of social activity. So the state exists to serve the people individually and collectively, and to preserve their right to guide themselves and their families, thank you, in accordance with their views of the person or of God or of life itself. What a terrifying thought that is for a communist leader, who would, of course, see such thinking as a challenge to the party's right to supply correct views of history, of the self, and of the community. Here is a microcosm of what they fear from a report on a trip to Vietnam by Professor Marianne Glendon of Harvard and Father Thomas Rees, who were members of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom when they made this trip. Here's what they said. Government officials become nervous when a local pastor has more credibility and authority in his village than the local party and government officials. For example, when the local officials tell demonstrating villagers to go home, they ignore them. But if pastors say, go home, they obey. Now, why is that? That is because the local pastor has moral authority and legitimacy, while the party and government officials do not. That is just what the regime fears. That is why the new law on belief and religion that Wolf and I mentioned is really about controlling and circumscribing belief and religion. That is why the Committee on Religious Affairs sits within the Ministry of the Interior. But What party officials do not realize is that they lack moral authority and legitimacy precisely because they prevent citizens from having freedom of religion and belief. The story of religious freedom in Vietnam reflects all of this. And, of course, its Communist Party leaders cling to the Leninist view of the party's political role, even as they abandon Marxist theories of economics. When it comes to religion, they suppress independent institutions and try to create fake state-owned substitutes. I'm delighted to be here today because this is precisely the moment to discuss these issues, both because we will soon have a new administration in Washington and because the Vietnamese government is seeking allies today as it tries to resist threats to its independence from China. President Obama, as Nina mentioned, lifted the arms embargo on Vietnam when he visited there in May. The question is whether the United States will use the closer relationship that Vietnamese leaders want to promote religious freedom, or will we forget about it and pursue what is meant to be a policy of realpolitik? Professor Glendon and Father Rees noted that some progress on religious freedom has been made since the communist takeover in 1975, and this gave them hope that improvements are possible. They also stated, quote, "It is also clear that Vietnamese officials want to have good relations with the United States." And they explained that what happens in Vietnam will have a real impact on freedom of religion throughout Southeast Asia. The trouble with allegedly realpolitik policies is that they are very often not terribly realistic. Whose independence and strength are we enhancing? That of the Vietnamese people or of the party and the regime? Will we be demanding that Vietnam meet the standards to which it is officially pledged as a signer of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or will we ignore those requirements? In fact, we know American pressure can work to relax the degree of oppression, to reduce the amount of thuggish behavior, to allow some more space for religious groups. It can work, but only if the United States government applies that pressure and makes it clear that improved relations depend on this. The Vietnamese regime will study this closely. It will reach conclusions about how much we care. We should care for reasons of principle, because we believe in freedom of conscience and thought and religion. But we should also care if we wish to see Vietnam develop into a stable society that will be a long-term American ally. We should be urging the regime to stop fearing its own people, to stop acting as if their civic activity is always a threat. We should be urging the Vietnamese regime that it can develop a more harmonious society if it will allow the people more freedom of religion. And we should be arguing that the only way for it to acquire the moral authority and legitimacy it seeks is to allow the people of Vietnam more freedom. Of course, they will resist because they will want it all. They want American weapons and investment and protection from China without reducing their control of society, without changing their belief that only the party is permitted to think, without trusting the Vietnamese people, without allowing freedom of religion. So the outcome depends in good part on us, on the United States. If we abandon the Vietnamese people, the party will not give an inch. If we press them, if we stick to our principles and make reasonable demands, we know from the last 40 years that they will move. As little as they can, of course, but they will move. The independent variable here is not the Vietnamese regime, whose attitude we can predict. The independent variable is the United States. Will we have the strength of character and belief to struggle for religious freedom in Vietnam. By acting together as we are today, we can make the answer to that question yes. That must be our goal this year and in the coming years under a new administration. Thank you.
Am I the tallest person at the podium? Does anyone mind if I take off my shoes? Don't tell anyone. There you go. That way I can see. Oh, thank you. There we go. That way I won't fall. Elliot Abrams stole my speech, so I will have to make another one right now. He said everything I was going to say. I'm only kidding. I'm very humbled to be here with you today, not only because Nina, Shea, and Elliot Abrams have been your champions for many, many years, but also because I'm humbled that you are here. Many people around the world think that things start in Washington, D.C., but they don't. They start with each one of you. Perhaps you hear my accent. Mm-hmm. Many of you have accents. I think accents are sexy, so I'm glad we're in good company. I am Cuban. My father escaped Fidel Castro's Cuba and married a German woman who had been in concentration camps in Germany. So we have grown up with freedom in our veins, in our household. Whenever I came home and I complained that homework was too hard, big mistake to complain to my father, he would say, we live in the greatest and freest country in the world. Now, work hard and everything can be possible. In this country, because of conscience freedom, because of freedom of religion, no one can touch what's in our hearts or in our minds. No one. And each one of you believes that. That's why you're here today, instead of enjoying a wonderful fall day touring Washington, D.C. So I thank you. The future of Vietnam thanks you for each one of your sacrifices, everything you have done for Vietnam. Please know, even on dark days, remember that it is up to you, not to the American government and not to the government of Vietnam, but it's up to your courage to change things in Vietnam. I also want to say we do have moral authority. In fact, we sort of have an unfair advantage over the government of Vietnam, and that is, in spite of all their weapons and all of their repression, we are right. Religious freedom comes when we're born, in each one of us. Religious freedom is tied to our human dignity, which no one can take away. Even if we're incarcerated, even if we're tortured, the government is unable to touch what's inside each one of us. Now it's time to put pressure on Vietnam. And we are at a unique moment of inflection, because we are changing administrations, and we can put pressure on the administration of this country. We can put pressure on the United States Department of State, and they in turn have to put pressure on the government of Vietnam and tell them that if Vietnam wants to be fully integrated into the world community, they have to treat religious freedom not as a gift of the state for those who behave well in the park, not as a gift that they own. Our rights do not come from the government. Therefore, the government cannot take them away. As Nina Shea mentioned, I wear two hats. I am the executive director of the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty, fighting for religious freedom here in this country. And I was recently appointed to the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. Sorry. Vietnam has made some improvements, as you well know. Sorry, it must be something emanating from the podium. Sorry. Vietnam has made some small improvements. However, as everyone has mentioned, there are these draconian laws that are coming our way. Now, when was the last time Vietnam made some real improvements? That was 2004, when the Department of State named it a country of particular concern. International pressure works, and United States pressure works. That should give each one of us great hope that the Vietnamese government wants not to be embarrassed before the international community. Another thing that the Vietnamese government doesn't want people to do is to name names. That's uncomfortable. So I'm going to name a few. Individuals that belong to Cao Day, as was mentioned earlier, the Montagnards, and the followers of Duan Van Minh, and forgive my bad Vietnamese, are all being persecuted. And authorities across Vietnam continue to issue threats to demolish the religious properties for the United Buddhist Church of Vietnam, for Catholics, from the Khmer Krom Buddhists, and for the Cao Dai. We need to continue to remind the world that Vietnam is not treating these religious groups fairly. And we need to remind the world about the ridiculous and mandatory requirements for registration that Vietnam, who seeks to be a modern country, wants to impose. We also need to remind the world about the Vietnamese prisoners of conscience. I'm sure you know their names well. Thich Quang Do, the patriarch of the Unified Buddhist Church of Vietnam, who has been, as you well know, under arrest since 2003. Win Công Chin, who was sentenced to 11 years in prison for undermining unity. And his wife, Tron Thi Hong, who was detained and questioned several times just because she met with Ambassador David Saperstein, our U.S. Ambassador for Religious Liberty. We also have to tell the world that the Venerable Tak Tuol, I practice all these names, I promise, I'm sorry if I'm massacring them, a Khmer Krom Buddhist, was sentenced to 6 years for attempting to leave the country. Christian human rights lawyer Nguyen Van Dai, activist Bu Thi Minh Hang, and Catholic blogger Nguyen Hu Nguyen, and countless Hoa Hao Buddhists, Cao Dai, and Montagnards, and others. We must name names. We must shine the light of truth on these names. Do not forget them. Recently, USERV participated in a conference in Asia. There were some Vietnamese human rights activists that wanted to attend. They were prevented from leaving the country. Not only that, they were questioned, detained, or arrested in connection for only wanting to attend the conference. In spite of those small positive developments, the stark reality is that from the standpoint of international religious freedom standards, which, as Mr. Abrams mentioned, Vietnam has signed on to respect and protect, Vietnam is not living up to its commitment. This conference deals with what we can do in the future. For starters, we need to ask the Department of State to name Vietnam a country of particular concern, CPC. And the U.S. government needs to name those names when they are in country. It's inexcusable that any government official should travel to China, and if I may put in a plug, to my native Cuba, and fail to name names. We should hold those people responsible for not naming names. Vietnam wants to be part of the world, and I'm sure it does. It needs to not treat religious liberty as the poor sister of the human rights family, or worse, as the eccentric uncle of the human rights family. Without religious freedom, no other right exists. Thank you very much. Don't look.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christina and Elliot. We're going to have a few questions and answers, and then when we finish that session, we're going to have Tina Mufford come up and make a few concluding remarks, and then before we move on to our next panel. I think we're just going to sit here while we have our exchange. I'm going to start with the first question to both of you. Both of you acknowledge the fact that democracy here in this country is so important to bolstering religious freedom abroad because of our values, and because it's basically good for the world and good for business and good for everything. It produces stable countries. But what can the audience, which we were so delighted, as Christina said, to see you here from all various states throughout this country, Vietnamese Americans. You are more numerous. I think Vove and I told us that it was several million of you here in the United States. What is the figure, Vove and I, Mr. Vo? Yeah. Yeah, 2 million Vietnamese Americans now. I was talking to the Polish government recently, and they told me that they think there's in the diaspora in the United States maybe 1 million Poles. And I was really surprised. I thought it was much greater than that because their impact was so significant during the Cold War and helping give support to the trade union solidarity and to other actors within the dissidents and those who are calling for peaceful transition to democracy in Poland during the Cold War. So you have a tremendous potential, and I'd like to ask both of you your views on what they can do. What would be helpful at this point?
I think the American political system is actually a fairly open system, open to influence from citizens. It's in the Constitution, the right to petition the government. I teach at Georgetown, as Nina mentioned, and one day I had a congressman come visit the class, and one of the students asked about lobbying, and asked it in a very negative term. Why do we permit so much lobbying? And the congressman replied, the Constitution gives citizens the right to petition their government. That means to go into senators and congressmen and congresswomen and say, here's what we want. So getting organized is really critically important. It's not so much the size of the community, although 2 million is a big community. It's the organization and it's the energy. You know, many members of Congress, I think, would be open to being taught about what's going on in Vietnam and open to being responsive to the need for religious freedom in Vietnam. Many of them are religious themselves and believers in religious freedom. So I think for the Vietnamese American community, the answer is getting organized and feeling completely free to press your demands on Congress.
That's excellent advice. I would also strongly suggest that you engage the members of the press in your community. Reporters are often stretched thin because media has changed, and that is to your advantage. There is a lot you can do with digital media, and that is through the social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And the reason I mention those things is that you have this tremendous opportunity to engage millennials, Americans between 18 and 35 years of age, who are thirsty to help other people out. I mean, you were in prison at 11. My 14-year-old this morning could not find his charger for his iPhone. I'm embarrassed to tell you that. And as a result, I think there's a great opportunity to give more meaning to the life of young Americans who want to fight for someone else and don't have the opportunity to do so. I have great faith in the American people. I think once you tell them about the suffering of others, they're very happy to engage. There's great respect for the Vietnamese community here. And you can start very small. You can start in your school systems. And let me remind you of something. Our current president, only a few years ago, was sitting in a room in Illinois, unknown. He was a state representative and became a senator. And Sarah Palin, who you probably all heard about, who was running for vice president, was the mayor of a teeny tiny town that no one had heard about before. Go to your local elected officials, introduce yourself, go have coffee with them, and make it your mission to keep other people informed. Name names.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's so important, and you have to make your own voices heard, and maybe later this afternoon you can strategize with Van I and Penelope about that further. There's also email to your members of Congress. You don't have to actually go there. You have, I know, a large presence, the Vietnamese American community in Northern Virginia here, in Texas, in California, in Louisiana. That's really important. And this is a particularly pivotal time during an election when you can get to the candidates and put them on the spot about where they stand on freedom of religion in Vietnam as well. So are there any questions from the floor? Yes, sir. Please identify yourself and use the microphone.
I'm Michael Benj, and I'm with the Montagnard Human Rights Organization. And perhaps I would address this to Mr. Abrams, but if anyone can offer an answer. A few years ago, we submitted to the Department of State and others a list of over 4,000 Montagnards in prison for religious persecution, And whenever the State Department comes up with a list of prisoners, and this was from only one tribe alone, it's the second largest tribe in Vietnam, over 4,000 people in prison for practicing house church religion. And this list was submitted to the Department of State. And whenever they come up with any of their lists of prisoners of conscience, they come up with 400, 500 people as prisoners of conscience. But these is over 4,000 people from one smaller group are prisoners of conscience. And they don't consider them prisoners of conscience. And unfortunately, many of the human rights NGOs do little more than parrot the Department of State list that there's only 400 prisoners of conscience. This is only one religion, and I'm very sure that others in the audience could come up with lists of hundreds of others.
Do you have those posted on your website?
I don't know whether it is now or not, but
okay,
I can...
Well, you should get that list to USURF as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I don't know this particular case. I mean, sometimes it's because they say they lack adequate information about each individual case. Sometimes it's a desire to avoid additional tension with the country in question, with the government in question. But I can't answer the question on the Montagnard case, sorry.
Any other questions from the audience?
Hi, I love your speech, both of you.
Thank you.
My name is Maureen. I'm with Vietnamese Public Radio from Oklahoma. We have the audience throughout the United States, through about 40 states of the United States and also 56 countries in global. So we established our media and connected with the Vietnamese throughout the world. As you mentioned, the Vietnamese population in the United States, roughly about 2 millions, but 2 millions scattered through the United States. So when you come to your local representative in your state level, you are nothing. Really, you are nothing. In Oklahoma, we have roughly about 20,000 Vietnamese in Oklahoma City. And 20,000 compared with 3 millions is nothing. So we are, and I'm strongly believe in everything you said. Freedom of religions is the air that you breathe. Without the freedom of religions, we are suffocate and we are not living at all. And you recognize it. We recognize it. The United States of America recognize it. But when you talk about politics, it's completely a different animal.
Okay.
You telling me 2004 that when you see a change in Vietnam because we put pressure on them, because we put them on CPC, and you sitting up there, you tell me why for the last 8 years we are not able to put Vietnam back on CPC. Tell me.
I did. Please, no.
I love your passion. And with that same passion, you should go meet with Senator Langford in Oklahoma. He is a passionate defender of religious freedom. I met with him a few months ago. He is not only a passionate defender of religious freedom, he has made it a priority. Not only that, there are several state-level initiatives in your state. There is a ballot in the in November having to do with religious liberty. Religious liberty is a hot topic in Oklahoma City, and people are very happy to hear about it. So never feel you're nothing. Never, ever, ever. You are of great importance as an individual, whether you're 3 Vietnamese or 4,000 Vietnamese.
Well, thank you. Matter of
One
fact,
thing, if I could add, is building coalitions with other groups is so important. And this can be done. It's something that I do in my work all the time. So we're trying to work with different religions. As Liv and I said, I'm Catholic, but I do this because I believe in religious freedom. I don't have any personal experience with persecution, thank God. But I work with the Buddhists. I work with Jewish groups. I work with all sorts of Middle Eastern groups. Right now, do a lot of work on ISIS threat to Iraq and Syria. So by building, I work with the Southern Baptists. By building coalitions, you can make a difference because there's enough shared interest in this great principle, this great American principle of religious freedom, an international principle now.
thanks. Actually, I'm a personal friend of Langford.
Oh,
I campaigned for him, but on the other hand, I also feel that he's only one of the 50.
but he's very tall and has a deep
And he got a beautiful voice too. But anyway,
Mr. Abrams, I'm sure,
Yeah,
wants to say
Yeah.
something up.
I think, look, many races for Congress, for the House of Representatives or for the Senate are difficult. They're close. No one throws away a community of 20,000. 20,000 people can be, 10,000 votes, 15,000 votes. That's significant in a close race. And the image of being concerned about religious freedom can be valuable to a member who's running. And as Nina says, it's also great if when you walk in, you are walking in not only with Vietnamese, but with representatives of 2 or 3 other groups, or with your local, let us say, Catholic bishop, you will get a hearing. Now, there is another question here. Let's be practical. And that question is, what's on the other side? For example, if your concern is building a dam on a river, and you are against it, but on the other side is some group 10 big companies that want the dam built, it's a fight. Who is so anxious to defend the communist government and the communist regime in Vietnam? Yes, there are some companies that want to do business with Vietnam that will probably lobby in Congress for opening without any standards whatsoever. But of course, you have a much better case. Freedom, human rights, freedom of religion. And no one running for office in this country wants to hear during his campaign or her campaign people saying, she doesn't care about human rights. She's selling us out. So I think it's a mistake to say that because there are only 2 million Vietnamese and you are scattered around the country, it's impossible to have political influence.
Yeah. I'm going to ask Tina Mumford to come up and make a few remarks. And we're going to, later this afternoon, after the panels are over, get into more of the nuts and bolts discussion about what the concerns are, what the priorities are, and how to make a difference. Tina, could you join us, please? Tina is the expert on Vietnam with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. That is an independent government agency. It advises the State Department and Congress, President, about religious freedom issues around the world in U.S. foreign policy. It also recommends CPC designation to the State Department and has recommended Vietnam since, I think, 2001. Tina, welcome. Adam, where should Tina speak from? Should she speak from the podium? This session today is being live streamed on our internet site at www.hudson.org. And it will be up for some time so you can see the events section of Hudson and you will have this whole thing recorded. Tina.
Thank you so much, Nina. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes. Yes? Okay. It's really wonderful to be here, and it's great to see so many familiar faces. I've met with a number of you over the years. So many of you come into town for Vietnam Advocacy Day every year, and it's nice to have a bit of a reunion to see all these lovely faces. So thank you for that. As I mentioned, every year, I see you for Vietnam Advocacy Day, and every year seems to be the same story, more or less. There are some small improvements, as others have noted, but still some major problems, and that's why we're all here today. As Nina mentioned, USCIRF did make a trip to Vietnam. It was a year ago, August, and it was a little different from some of the Commission's previous trips. We had relative freedom of movement. We weren't overtly followed, and our trip wasn't interfered with in some of the traditional ways that the Commission's trips have experienced in the past. And we saw that as a good sign. There were a lot of highs and lows during the trip. One of our highs, we had the distinct honor of meeting with Thich Quang Do. That was a really personal, moving experience for many of us. But there were some low points as well. One of the very last meetings that we had was with Duong Bong Min. And one of the members of the group was arrested as he made his way home. Arrested, beaten, tortured, and held in secret for days before he was finally released. Fortunately, we had excellent work done by the U.S. Embassy and the U.S. Consulate to work to get him freed as soon as possible. But it's just indicative of the struggles that still remain and why we're all here today. As others have noted, one of the biggest hurdles that we're all facing right now is this new law on religion. There are some modest steps at improving religious policy in the country, but there's a lot that remains to be desired. And it's a lot of it is an overall attitude of the need to have such tight control over religion. There's really no reason for that. There's no excuse for that. But that's what this law in its current form represents. It's an attitude of needing approvals for everything that you do rather than providing simple notifications. If we were to improve the law, that's certainly what we would ask for. Just create a conversation between religious communities and local officials. Say, hey, I just want to notify you, we're going to have an activity soon, FYI. But instead, it's a series of approval after approval after approval, and that really creates a tension where there really doesn't need to be one. There needs to be better mechanisms in the law for the government to be responsive to requests from religious communities. It can be simple, it can be complicated, but the government needs to respond, and they need to do so in a timely manner. We certainly know that doesn't exist currently. This law could be a mechanism to improve that, but in its current form, we're just not seeing it. Another thing we'd want to see in the law, just leave unregistered groups alone. Let them do their thing, let them practice and worship in private. They're not harming you. They're going to leave you alone if you leave them alone. There also needs to be a way to provide legal recognition to those who just really don't want to be associated with the government. It's okay. It doesn't mean that they're working against you. They just want to do their own thing. They want to remain unregistered and unrecognized. So just let them do so. That would be our advice to the government of Vietnam as they move forward on the law on religion. As was noted earlier, the visit by President Obama to Vietnam earlier this year in May was a little disappointing. If I can speak from my personal point of view rather than my official USERF capacity, to give away such an important leverage point by lifting the arms ban as they did, we didn't really get much in return. Yes, Father Lee was released, and we're all really grateful for that. But it seems a little imbalanced, in my personal opinion. So that was a really disappointing visit. Yes, the president met with religious leaders, but some who went to go meet him were blocked from meeting him or were harassed when they tried to go meet him. And there weren't any real consequences for that. To me, that's a huge problem. This is the president of the United States, and he was there to hold a legitimate meeting with religious leaders, and that was interfered with so heavily. And there were no consequences. To me, it doesn't sit right. It was very heartbreaking, and I wish that had gone otherwise. The very last thing that I'll touch on is the designation of country of particular concern. I don't have a good explanation as to why there is no CPC. It's something that USERF has consistently every year recommended. We will continue to do so unless there's some great sea change of improvement in religious freedom in Vietnam. There's a lot of usefulness in the CPC designation. Yes, it's about naming the worst violators of religious freedom. But when it comes to Vietnam, a country where we've seen the CPC work to some degree in the past, I don't see this as a tool for admonishment. I see it as a way to reignite the partnership between the United States and Vietnam to improve religious freedom. This was a partnership that worked in the past. Both sides had mutual benefits to engaging in the CPC. I feel it could be repeated because both countries still need that strategic relationship to deepen and grow. So what better time to reignite the CPC mechanism and start again? It's both sides coming to the table and in partnership, deciding on ways that can benefit religious freedom, can benefit the people of Vietnam, and strengthen the relationship bilaterally. For many people, we know at USERF that the CPC recommendation that we make every year, it's a beacon of hope, because we know that you see the significance of it, as do we, and absent the actual designation from the State Department, USERF continually recommending it is a sign of hope for you all. And that means a lot to us, and we hope it means a lot to you. And as long as it's necessary, we're going to keep making that recommendation, because we see what it means to you and what it means to us as well. I think just lastly, I would reiterate something that Kristina said. Just last month, I was in East Timor for a conference on religious freedom in Southeast Asia, and several of the participants who were traveling from Vietnam were blocked from traveling, and several others who, once they got home, they were harassed, arrested, etc., simply for attending. But when I was in Timor, I met several of the participants who had been able to make the trip, and I spoke with them, and they were afraid of what would happen to them when they returned, and yet they were still there. They still had the courage to get on that plane and make the trip, knowing full well what could be waiting for them when they return. That was so moving to me, that they would put themselves at such great risk. You know, what did I do? I worried about, you know, making sure I had my plane tickets and you know, a snack for the plane. They had to worry about, were they going to be brutalized, arrested, worse when they returned? It just really put things into perspective, and again, it was very personally moving to be able to speak with them and know that they put a lot on the line to be there, simply to be able to speak freely about religious freedom. And I had it so much easier, yet I benefited greatly from the honor and privilege of meeting them. So I'll leave it there. Thank you again so much for being here and for allowing me to share a few words with you.
Thank you, Tina. I really appreciate it. Those were great remarks. Well, we're past time, but I thought I'd give our guests, who I know are really busy, and I really appreciate their being here, if you want to have one last word on you have anything in mind, the religion law or anything else?
We have a new government coming in the United States. There will be hundreds of new officials in the White House and the State Department, and on Capitol Hill, members and staff who don't know much about this issue. So there is a job ahead of educating them, but it is also a great opportunity which you should seize.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Thanks. Good to see you.
I'm going to now ask Penelope Faulkner to come to the stage. And Penelope, of course, is the vice chair of the Vietnamese Committee for Human Rights, and our next group of panelists.
Shall we invite them up now? Or
yes. Yeah. If you could
please,
come up.
Sarah?
I'm going to step down.
Shall we ask them to move? Would you like them to move? Yes. Would it be possible for us to
I don't know, Adam. Could the podium go back up on the stage? Or? Sure. Or can they use the microphone? Or?
We're going to put microphones off. Oh, okay. So whilst you're doing this.
Oh, okay. So they don't need a podium at all.
It will be helpful to send them on that.
I don't know if it can go on.
Are you taller than me? Or about the same? Okay. If you'd like to come and sit on the, yeah? Yeah, yes, would you please, yeah. Yes. I have the same problem as Kristina, but I can't take my shoes off, so I'll just have to be... yeah, that might be an idea. Yeah, what about... Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Oh, no, that's... it's pretty low now. It's too small. Okay. This is a really, for me, really fascinating event as well when I said extraordinary, because I've been working for Vietnam for longer than I would like to tell you, but I think it's really very important that the speeches we've had this morning put into perspective the whole situation of Vietnam. And I think what's important for us now is to listen to the victims. I think it's very strange, you know, when you talk about Vietnam and religious freedom, we've been listening to the problem of the laws and all the other things. But when the people, the victims themselves speak, they come from different religious communities and they have different experiences, but their stories that they're going to tell you now are very much the same. They're stories of repression under a government which is seeking to stifle any kind of independent voices. And I think this is somehow, I think, where all of you, and I'm sure, share a frustration, is that when you talk about Vietnam, a lot of people say, well, Vietnam now is so much better. You go to Vietnam, the churches are open, people are going to pagodas, you can see religious freedom. What are you talking about, repression? But on the one hand, you have this facade of religious tolerance, but underneath you have this repression on an everyday scale against all religious communities. So we're very, very happy to have a panel of experts here today. Some are direct victims of religious repression themselves. Others are experts who've studied the question for many years. And so we're going to hear their different stories. We'd like to begin today. The first speaker is Mr. Vo Tran Nhat, who is Executive Secretary of the Vietnam Committee on Human Rights. He's going to be talking about non-recognized religions and specifically the Unified Buddhist Church of Vietnam. Vo Tran Nhat is somebody who's been working on Vietnam for several years. He speaks regularly at the United Nations. He's published and authored reports on legal questions and prison conditions. And he has a master's degree in public law and a postgraduate diploma at the European Law School in Paris. So I begin, first of all, with Vo Tran Nhat. You want to be up or down?
Thank you.
Oh dear.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, yeah.
Very soon, Vietnam will adopt a law on religion and belief, but religious freedom will not benefit from it. For this law is only details or modify the registration system already in laws, in force. In this system, you can practice religious only if you are registered, and you are registered only if the government accepts your request. In the end, the government decides if you can practice your religion or not. This does not comply with international law, but this is the Communist Party's policy, and it always has been. On the contrary, the Unified Buddhist Church of Vietnam, or UBCV, advocates that everyone is entitled to enjoy religious freedom and all other human rights without interference from the government. Buddhism came to Vietnam over 2,000 years ago, and the majority of the Vietnamese are Buddhist. Vietnam has two main streams of Buddhism, Theravada and Mahayana. But the Mahayana school is predominant. Mahayana focuses on saving all the society and has shaped the Vietnamese Buddhism into an engaged Buddhism. In Vietnamese history, each time oppression threatened from inside or from outside the country, freedom and social justice, Vietnamese monks and nuns mobilized against it, then returned peacefully in their pagodas. That's why we can consider Buddhism as a matrix for the Vietnamese nation. Thanks to this engaged Buddhism, Viet people around the Red River Delta escaped assimilation to China despite 1,000 years of Chinese occupation. From the French colonial period up to the early 60s, Buddhism was not entitled to function as a church in its own rights, but was limited to a status of a mere association under colonial decree number 10. Buddhists were only able to officially establish a church in 1964, after the abrogation of this decree, and it became the Unified Buddhist Church of Vietnam. In 1975, after the end of the Vietnam War, Vietnam was reunified under the Communist Party, and Hanoi's leaders tried to dismantle all religion, especially Buddhism, which they considered, and they still consider, a threat to the power. They confiscated UBC properties, burned religious books, arrested monks, nuns, and lay Buddhists, or forced them to join the army. Prominent dignitary Thich Thien Minh was tortured to death. Thich Huyen Quang and Thich Quang Do was placed in solitary confinement. But this terrible repression failed to destroy the UBCV. The communist regime realized that it could not eradicate religions, so it plans to control them. In 1981, the Communist Party created a state-sponsored church, the Vietnam Buddhist Sangha, which became the only Buddhist association recognized by the government. All Buddhists were pressed to join it, and later the same plan was used to fabricate other state churches for the other religions. The main architect of that plan, communist official Do Tung Heo, explained later that the creation of the state church was not a Buddhist project, but the work of the Communist Party alone, and its aim was to transform Vietnamese Buddhism into a tool of the Communist Party. Indeed, among all the Buddhists who founded the state church, there was no official representative of the UBCV. The party even forged a false UBCV seal and pretended that the UBCV was part of the state Buddhist church. This organization is truly a political tool. State church officials are members of the Communist Party, and some monks and nuns are even members of the National Assembly, in contradiction with the Buddhist monastic vow. Of course, UBCV leaders and followers refused to accept this ban of the church and kept up their activity despite repression. Thich Quang Do continued to publicly speak out for religious and human rights, and in 2005 he set up a network of representative boards to conduct educational, spiritual and humanitarian programs for people in the poor provinces. As Hanoi never succeeded in suppressing UBCV, the party has launched a new religious policy. Hanoi then tolerates wider freedom of worship, but does not tolerate religious freedom. That means state pagodas can organize ceremonies, but cannot make true religious teachings, nor preach on subjects not in line with the Communist Party's directives. The policy is smart. It gives the impression that Buddhists are free to practice their religion, but without true Buddhist teachings, this practice is only empty shell. As a result, religious practices become more and more like superstition, and for people do not understand real meaning of ceremony and rite anymore. At the same time, the government has sent security police to infiltrate false monks into pagoda, at least 3,000 of them. They are policemen and watch everything from inside. Moreover, they adopt improper behavior, trying to ruin the prestige of the monks among the population. Nowadays, religious persecution against Buddhism is less visible in Vietnam. That's right. But it's still terrible. In fact, Vietnamese authorities use what we call stealth repression. Buddhists are not put on trial or detained in official prison anymore, but suffer harsh harassment on a daily basis. They are denied the right to travel, routinely summoned for police interrogation, subjected to intimidation, public denunciation sessions, and expulsion from the pagodas. Police hire thugs to assault them and vandalize their property. To punish UBCV followers, local authorities refuse to deliver them mandatory residence permits, expel Buddhist child from school, and or make people lose a job. In many UBCV pagodas in Vietnam, celebration of Buddhist festivals are prohibited. In this perspective, the current patriarch of the UBCV, Thich Quang Do, who is now 88 years old, is a symbol. He has been detained for more than 30 years because during his whole life he has advocated peacefully religious freedom and human rights. He has been detained in various forms and is now under house arrest in Saigon. He is deprived of his citizenship rights and unable to travel or communicate freely. Sometimes the authority allows diplomats to visit him, and very recently Western diplomats told us off the record that the authority had informed them that Thich Quang Do was forbidden to preach because it belonged to a non-recognized religion. The Buddhist youth movement is also victim of persecution. This organization is affiliated to the UBCV and has a membership of over 300,000 young Buddhists in Vietnam. Since 2014, over 100 members have been placed under house arrest. Its head, Le Con Cao, is subjected to continuous harassment, threat, and police interrogation. In May, for example, during the visit in Vietnam of President Obama, police detained Le Con Cao at home and to prevent him from visiting Thich Quang Do in Saigon. I would like to conclude with the following observation. Repression against UBCV is unlikely to end. The UBCV is still a strong popular movement, and Thich Quang Do says that can be no religious freedom without human rights and democracy. However, the one-state party does not tolerate dissent, and Hanoi has stated clearly that it will never legalize the UBCV if Thich Quang Do remains at its head. The future law on religion and belief has been conceived to enforce state control on religions and will be used by the Communist Party to reinforce its power. Indeed, Vietnam's aim is not to implement the rule of law, but the rule by law. By adopting a series of laws restricting the exercise of human rights and legalizing arbitrary repression, the law on religion and belief is one of them. Moreover, this law is a trap for religions. Non-registered organizations are not allowed to practice religion, and there is no religious freedom for them. Religious groups which agree to be registered have to accept the total control of the Communist Party over their organization, their activities, the content of the teachings, their leadership and membership. There is no religious freedom for them either. In the end, applying for registration means renouncing the right to religious freedom. That's why the Supreme Patriarch of the UBCV, Thich Quang Do, has made it very clear that the UBCV will never apply for registration for as long as it remains at its head. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. That's still too high again. Thank you. Yeah, that shows the repression against the Buddhists by law, by repression, by brutality in many different ways. The next community we're going to hear from is the Montagnard, who suffered very serious repression in Vietnam, and we're really very happy to have a speaker who I think is one. I told her she's the best. She's Sarah Combe is the specialist on Southeast Asia. She's lived in Cambodia. She's worked for over 20 years, and she's really somebody who's taken to heart the problems of the Montagnard peoples, and she's been one of the basic voices, the most vocal people to bring this to the fore. Sarah Combe is, she was from 1992 to 2011. She was based in Cambodia, where she served as human rights monitor for the UN peacekeeping mission, advisor to Cambodian and international human rights organizations, and consultant. And she is now a consultant, an independent researcher for Amnesty International and the campaign to abolish torture in Vietnam. And as I say, we're very honored that she's come a long way to be here today. So thank you, Sarah. The floor is yours.
Greetings. Thank you very much. And thank you for your wonderful introduction. So I'm going to be talking about the repression of Montagnard Christians in the Central Highlands of Vietnam. And Tony will talk about the Hmong in the Northwest Highlands after me. I think that it's, in looking at the question as to why are Montagnard Christians so severely repressed in Vietnam, it's useful to look back a little bit at the history, and I'll do a quick review for you. During the colonial regime, the French brought in some Catholic priests, and people throughout Vietnam began to slowly convert to Catholicism, followed in the early 20th century, around 1911, by missionaries from the CMA, which is the Christian and Missionary Alliance, introducing Christianity formally into Vietnam. And as a result of CMA's efforts, the Evangelical Church of Vietnam was founded in 1927, initially with only a little more than 4,000 members. A couple of years after that, in 1929, 1930, CMA began working in the Central Highlands. They had some centers in Buôn Ma Thuột, in Dak Lak, and in Pleiku. And over the years, the numbers of Montagnards who converted from their traditional beliefs, which were more along the lines of animism or respect and worshiping spirits in nature and ancestor spirits, Montagnards many of them began to convert to Christianity. By 1975, throughout Vietnam, there were about 200,000 evangelical Christians, of whom 1/3 were estimated to be minority people from the mountains, from either the Central Highlands or the Northwest Highlands. And this growth continued to sort of dramatically increase over time, so that by 1975, with the change in the government, there was a dramatic effort to close down this movement by imprisoning pastors, by closing churches, by being very restrictive about the practice of Christianity in the highlands, as well as throughout Vietnam. During the 80s and the 90s, there was sort of a quiet movement, house churches. People were quietly continuing their religion when they could by sort of secretly practicing their religion in their homes with just very few people. This house church movement grew despite the harassment and threats by the government, and to the point where it was a significant movement in the late 80s and early 90s. By 2000, 2001, there were estimated to be more than 1 million evangelical Christians in Vietnam, of whom more than half were Montagnards in the Central Highlands. So that's a very dramatic growth, where at this point, if you look at from 1975 to now, the numbers of Montagnard Christians have essentially quadrupled, 4 times the amount in 1975. So this is a significant population. It's a significant sort of movement in Vietnam. And, excuse me. So I want to just talk now about sort of the waves of repression in the last 20 years or so by the government against Montagnard Christians. And I think something that also needs to be taken into account when discussing the history is that during the 70s and 80s, the Montagnards had an armed resistance movement called Fulro. Many of the Fulro members were Christians. They were fighting against the government as a guerrilla movement. That movement died out as a fighting force in 1992 when the last of the Fulro fighters were airlifted out of their jungle hiding places in Cambodia. So this is important to sort of understand when looking at Montagnard Christianity, because when Fulro was taken out as a fighting force, when it was no longer a force in Vietnam, at that same time the popularity of Christianity amongst Montagnards began to grow even more. And in a sense, it was a non-violent sort of movement for religion and for ethnic pride as well, by having their own churches and wanting to control their own affairs. So in around 2000, an activist Montagnard movement, which has been called Daga Christianity, or in Vietnamese would be Tin Lan Daga, emerged in the Central Highlands. And this movement, it was a religious movement, but it also had combined the evangelical Christianity with aspirations for greater political freedom, for protection of ancestral lands, and for some autonomy or self-rule. So it was a political and a religious movement that were combined. And in 2001, less than a year later, there were massive demonstrations by Montagnards in 4 provinces of the Central Highlands. Okay. Can you hear me still? Okay. Calling for religious freedom and greater land rights. The government's response was extremely harsh. Tanks were brought in, military were dispatched to the region, hundreds of people were arrested. Many more fled to Cambodia as refugees. And the government at that time since that time has alleged that a form of Montagnard Christianity, this Tin Lan Daga, they say is not a religion. It's not a real religion, they say. They say that it is actually a guise for a political movement, a separatist political movement. And it's been this rationale has been used to close down hundreds of churches, to imprison hundreds of Montagnards throughout the last 16 years on charges that they are Tin Lan Daga and or Fulro, even though there's no evidence that Fulro or any armed movement continues amongst the Montagnards in the Central Highlands. And even though the Montagnards themselves advocate peaceful change regarding their land rights and their human rights. So I wanted to share with you some things that some Montagnard Christians told me when they fled from Vietnam to Cambodia. I've interviewed hundreds of Montagnards. I was based in Cambodia for almost 20 years. And people crossing the border told me why they fled, and they also told me about their religion, their religious beliefs. One old man told me, before we had religion, meaning Christianity, before we had religion, we were ignorant. We were in the dark. We drank wine and did not know about our land. Then we saw the light and realized our rights were being violated. We realized our land was being confiscated, our ethnicity crushed and destroyed. That's why the Vietnamese government prohibits our religion. Many people told me, I would say, what is the difference between Tin Lan, evangelical Christianity, and Tin Lan Dega? And it was really hard to get a clear answer. Some people who had been arrested and accused of being Tin Lan Dega never called themselves that. They had never even heard of it. Whereas those who'd heard of it, they would say the difference is that Tin Lan Dega and Tin Lan, they're not much different. One comes from America, that's Tin Lan, and then Tin Lan Dega is from us Montagnards ourselves. But basically it's one religion with two parts. So they're basically wanting to manage their own religion, like many other religious groups in Vietnam. And they say that Tin Lan is a religion that preaches harmony and for people to think about our ancestral land. So these are pretty mild goals. These are not goals to overthrow the government violently. They are really voicing their wishes to manage their own religious activities. I would say that, when asked about the question of are Tin Lan Dega, are they seeking a separate state? Some are, yes, for sure. But others, they are talking about, I want my land back. I used to have a coffee field and it's gone. I have no way to support my family. I want my patch of land back. Others may say that they would like to have some control over their religious groups or their localities, whereas others go so far as to say that they want a separate state. But all of this is advocated peacefully, and I think that one of the issues, one of the problems that U.S. government policy has fallen into is in distinguishing between the good Montagnards who agree to go to churches under the recognized Evangelical Church of Vietnam South, and those who don't agree. And in many cases, U.S. government policy has fallen into the trap of basically agreeing with Vietnamese government policy by saying that the Montagnards they are separatists, the Tin Lan Dega, they are separatists. We are not going to put them on our lists. We'll take the ones who are ECVN recognized pastors, a much smaller number. Both groups should be on the U.S. government's list of prisoners of conscience, and the U.S. government should not be staying clear of people who have simply advocated nonviolently for their political and religious ideas. So I mentioned there were large demonstrations in 2001, which resulted in many hundreds of people arrested and fleeing to Cambodia. There were demonstrations again in 2002, in 2004, in 2008, and maybe for sure other demonstrations that no one has ever heard of, because the Central Highlands is a very closed area. It is very difficult for independent press or human rights researchers to gain access to the Central Highlands. And when events happen in the Central Highlands, it's rarely covered in the international media. It's very, very difficult. So, for example, how many people here know that on August 30th, just a couple of weeks ago, 2 Jarai Christians were sentenced to prison, 11 years and 8 years. So it's a couple of weeks ago. There's no outcry, there's no press, there's no names, there's very little attention paid to this. They were accused of being Tinlandega and being Fulro. Why does the government always accuse people of being Tinlandega and Fulro? Because it's written into the law. The laws that were passed as reform measures resulting from the dialogue between the U.S. government and Vietnam, the laws in 2005 specifically outlawed legalization of churches who are Tinlandega or who have connections to Fulro. So when you look at the Vietnamese newspaper articles from the state press, that is the accusation for everyone. They're Tinlandega and they're Fulro. So now there's a Catholic group that is becoming very popular in the Central Highlands called Hmong, after the place where it was founded. Hundreds of people have joined the Hmong Catholics. That group has also had an activist background because they have opposed the displacement of villagers in Kontum for a dam for a hydropower project. So the government is arresting many of these people and having trials of them in the villages to sort of scare the villagers from joining Hmong, and is saying that they too are connected to Fulro and Tinlandega. So they put it all in the same box. I think I'll stop here with just one more point. In terms of the Catholics who are now under pressure in the Central Highlands, the Hmong Catholics. If you want to know about this, you just read the Vietnamese official media. It's all there. Recently, there was a 2-year campaign to eradicate Hmong Catholicism in Yalai province in 4 districts. And so I'm just going to tell you what the official press in Vietnam, I think it was probably the police newspaper, they said, over 2 years, in order to destroy Hmong Catholicism, we held more than 120 meetings to mobilize 12,000 people. We brought 144 subjects before public review. You go in your village, you are called before the entire village, and you are criticized. You are forced to confess to wrongdoing. You are made to swear your allegiance to the party and to renounce your religion. This led to 74 people who had been in hiding were discovered by the authorities. 534 people voluntarily abandoned Hmong Catholicism. In addition, the police, in cooperation with centrally directed Central Highlands Mobile Police Regiment, mobilized 2,500 soldiers and officers to conduct 85 raids. This led to the apprehension of 38 core personnel and destroyed the 25 underground Fulro networks who were using Hmong Catholicism, and re-educated 148 core subjects. I mean, these kind of statistics are often in Vietnamese police newspaper accounts because they want to sort of describe how they are feeling, completing government campaigns to eradicate these types of religions. So it's all there right in the press. Finishing off with just some recommendations. Of course, the recommendations that USERF makes and that Vietnam Committee for Human Rights makes, Montagnard Human Rights Organization, and Khmer Krom, all those recommendations are very good regarding eliminating rigorous registration requirements and putting pressure on Vietnam. I would also just underscore the importance of not focusing solely on religious freedom to the detriment of people who are religious freedom activists or who are human rights defenders, who are trying to get assistance to the families of Montagnard prisoners, or people who are even calling for greater land rights when they meet to pray. It's important not to separate those people out, because they're the ones who are really the unseen victims. They're the people who are languishing in Vietnamese prisons. According to the numbers that I have, there are at least 175, 200 Montagnards who remain in prison, and that's a large number and is rarely ever mentioned by U.S. government when they meet with Vietnam, these specific people. So, thank you very much.
I'd love to have lots of comments about this because I'm an activist too, but I'm watching the clock and I know that we have 3 more speakers to speak today, so I will say as little as possible. But I do think when Saren gives you the figures from the Vietnamese press, you realize that there's one whole thing that you're realizing that you can read in the international press, but when you read the figures in the Hanoi press, and those aren't always the full story, that's just half the story, but you see there's 2 completely different faces of religious repression in Vietnam. So the next speaker we're also very honored to have here today is going to talk about the situation of the Hmong people in Vietnam, Mr. Tong Vang. And he is a specialist. He has 2 hats, actually. He has a security hat and a human rights hat. He is director of the Southeast Asia Monitor for Justice and Human Rights. He's a consultant with portfolios in human rights and security services. And he was a former lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, and he had management responsibilities over humanitarian assistance, education, maritime security, and peacekeeping operations. So with no more ado, I hand the floor to Mr. Tong Vang.
Thank you, Penelope. Let me take this opportunity to thank the Vietnam Commission and the Hudson Institute for the opportunity. It really is a privilege, and I'm glad to be here to speak on the Hmong in Vietnam. But let me begin with a little background. I am of Hmong descent, born in Laos, raised in America, and naturalized here. I grew up in a Christian home. So for the longest time, I thought all Hmong were Christians. And it would be later that I would learn and realize that actually the Christians are actually a minority of the Hmong community in the U.S. and worldwide. Hmong generally follow or adhere to a form of animism in which a shaman plays a large role. You may call that a folk religion, as some do, but in short, the Hmong are a deeply religious people like you and many others. Some Hmong reside in North America, in Europe, in French Guiana, a little bit off the beaten path. But the most significant numbers are found in China, Vietnam, and Laos in that order. It's interesting that even though Vietnam ranks second, we really don't hear much discussion about Hmong there. But I can tell you that inside the community, there is no doubt that the Hmong population there suffer the most in the entire world. Now, the lack of religious freedom is a large part of that suffering. Why? Because unlike in America, the number of Christians actually far outnumber the non-Christians, almost 70 to 30. Whereas in America, you have less than 20% who are Christians. But let's be fair. In Vietnam, they are not forced to follow any particular religion. They can actually choose. But as one person told me, yes, there is more freedom, but not for the Hmong. There is an unequivocal difference between the Vietnamese majority and the Hmong minority when it comes to religious freedom. We are all aware of the requirement to register. And it's not simply going somewhere and saying, hey, this is us, this is what we do, thanks. You have to be affiliated with an organization, supported by the government. You, of course, have to submit your yearly or annual report on your Christian activities, and these are nothing new. What strikes me is the fact that you can't have a standalone building of worship, that someone has to actually occupy that building. It has to be a residence. There is the prohibition, unstated, of having contact with foreigners. And if you are visited by foreigners, you're also going to be visited by officials. It's more of an investigation, and that investigation extends to money and funds. You see from these restrictions that there isn't support for what we would consider as normal everyday life activities. I call that basic rights, basic human rights. It's a system of control, one that isolates and harasses with administration and physical intimidation. So I'd like us to think or consider the larger context in which religious freedom fits. The people there, the Hmong people there in Vietnam, are experiencing this kind of restricted religious freedom, along with a lack of running water, along with sufficient food to eat. So, in a phrase, there is no nourishment for the soul or the body. I will just shift quickly now to the security implications. Okay. For me, when a nation or a government or a people oppress another, one should, of course, always be aware of all the potential consequences. But I don't worry so much about the bullet. In my experience working overseas, you have people who live in the mountains, who are neglected by the local government, who don't know or don't have the resources to practice good hygiene. They're far from the cities. It's really a perfect place for disease to develop. I was overseas in a country which was ground zero for Ebola. It didn't break out in the cities. And if it did, you're much closer to the resource that can contain that. So I offer that as one implication, security-wise, that we may or may not be thinking about. And let me leave you with this question: how will we continue to pivot toward Asia? It's been a while since we heard about that strategic move, if you will. And I would just like to remind you that international religious freedom is a tenet of our U.S. foreign policy. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. I said they're all different stories, but they all tell you the same story, one of repression again and again. It's incredible. We have two speakers now who are going to talk about the Khmer Krom Buddhist situation. And I think, if I'm not wrong, it's a very large population. It's more than 1 million. Is that correct? So it's very important, but it's something that you very, very rarely hear about in international conferences. So we're very pleased and very honored to have two speakers today. And I was looking at their notes on their life stories, and incredibly short. And I was looking at Venerable Kim Mul. He's a Khmer Krom Buddhist monk, and it just simply says he's a Buddhist monk and former political prisoner. He participated in a peaceful protest to demand religious freedom in February 2007. And he was arrested, defrocked, and sentenced to 2 years prison in Vietnam. It sounds very short, but that 2 years prison in Vietnam says a lot. And we have a phrase in Vietnamese which says, one day in prison is longer than 1,000 years outside. We say, I've got it all wrong. And that's what it is. Prison is a terrible thing. So we're very happy now to introduce, I don't know if you're speaking separately or speaking together, but we have Venerable Kim Mun and also Mr. Prak Serivuth, who's Vice President of the Khmer Kampuchea Krom Federation, and he's been advocating fundamental rights and religious freedom for the Khmer Krom people for several decades now. So please.
He doesn't speak English, so he speaks Khmer, so I need to translate for him.
Yes, certainly, please do.
And then I will speak my own.
Okay, please. Would you like to sit down or would you like to...
Either one.
Is he mic'd up?
Earphone. Sorry.
No, it's okay. There's nobody here. No, my microphone's still on.
No.
Yeah.
នឹងសូមចម្រើនពរញាតិញោមភ្ញៀវជាតិនិងអន្តរជាតិជាពិសេសញាតិញោមបងប្អូនវៀតណាមទាំងអស់គ្នាដែលបានចូលរួមនៅក្នុងវិទ្យាស្ថានHudson ហ្នឹងអាត្មាអត់មានអីទេគេតែមាននិយាយរឿងខ្លះអំពីវៀតណាមដែលបានចាប់អាត្មាសឹកកាលពីឆ្នាំ2007
Good afternoon to my fellow Vietnamese friend. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Hudson Institute for organizing this event. I don't have much story to tell, but just my personal story when I was defrocked and was imprisoned in Vietnam in 2007.
នឹងរដ្ឋាភិបាលកុម្មុយនីសវៀតណាមនឹងកាលឆ្នាំ2007ថ្ងៃ8កុម្ភៈឆ្នាំ2007កន្លងនឹងក៏បានចាប់អាត្មានឹងដាក់គុកហើយចោទអាត្មានឹងថាជាអ្នកធ្វើបាតុកម្មប្រឆាំងរដ្ឋាភិបាលណាហើយចោទអាត្មានឹងថាដើរញុះញង់ដើម្បីទាមទារផ្ដួលរំលំរដ្ឋាភិបាលវៀតណាមអញ្ចឹងទៅចាប់អាត្មាដាក់គុកដល់ពេលចាប់អាត្មាដាក់គុកហើយក៏គេបែរជាថាអាត្មានោះធ្វើខូចសណ្ដាប់ធ្នាប់សង្គមគេថាហ្គៃគួយចឹកទៅកុំណាទេ
On 8th of February 2007, I was arrested by the Vietnamese government authority, accusing me of organizing a rally the Khmer Krom ethnic indigenous people in the Mekong Delta to uprising against their government, which it was not true.
ហើយក្រោយមកឆ្នាំ2012-13ហ្នឹងក៏បានចាប់កូនសិស្សអាត្មា4នាក់ទី1ថៃធឿនទី2លីវនីទី3ថៃភូមិរិទ្ធទី4ត្រាវន្ថាហ្នឹងដាក់គុកទៀតដោយសារលោកហ្នឹងរៀនអក្សរខ្មែរហើយដោយសារភូមិអាត្មាហ្នឹងវាមានបងប្អូនមកបរទេសច្រើនមកប្រទេសកៅច្រើនអញ្ចឹងទៅលោកក៏នៅវត្តមួយអាត្មាហ្នឹងគេថាយើងហ្នឹងតាក់ទងប្រទេសកៅដើម្បីកសឹបខ្សួលគ្នាដើម្បីរកកលផ្ដួលរំលំរដ្ឋាភិបាលវៀតណាម
Later on, for my friend who Khmer Kram Buddhistman has been arrested and imprisoned just like myself, they accused us the crime of teaching the Khmer language at the Buddhist temple. We practice Theravada Buddhism. We have to teach Khmer to our people to learn the Buddhism. And in addition to that, since those people have a lot of relatives and friends who escaped from Vietnam to the United States and Europe, so their contact just like friendly relationship. They accused us of like organized rebellion against the Hanoi government. That was a crime, and they've been in jails.
នឹងដូចជាបន្តិចថៃភូមិរដ្ឋបន្ទាប់ចេញហ្នឹងកូនសិស្សអាត្មាចេញពី3ខែចេញពីគុកមកហ្នឹងវារដ្ឋាភិបាលកុម្មុយនីសហ្នឹងចេះតែតាមដានរហូតធ្វើឲ្យគ្នាហ្នឹងសូម្បីតែម៉ែឪគ្នាហ្នឹងមិនចង់ហ៊ានឲ្យនៅផ្ទះធ្វើឲ្យបងប្អូនដែលធ្លាប់ស្គាល់ពីមុនមកណាធ្វើឲ្យបងប្អូនដែលធ្លាប់ស្គាល់ពីមុនមកមិនហ៊ានហៅព្រោះណាធ្វើឲ្យគ្នាប្រៀបដូចជាធ្វើឲ្យចង់ឲ្យបន្តិចហ្នឹងហត់ជីងមកកៅមិនចង់ឲ្យនៅស្រុកកម្ពុជាក្រមទៀតទេ
Several of them were released from prison. The communist government authority still intimidate them, follow them every step, make them so difficult to live. They intimidate their family. From my concern, they don't want us to live longer in the Mekong Delta. So just like indirectly pressure us to escape outside of Vietnam. By pressure us indirectly.
ថ្ងៃទី2ទៀតហ្នឹងអាត្មាអត់មានអីទេគ្រាន់តែថែលបាបញាតិញោមប៉ុណ្ណឹងពួកឯរដ្ឋាភិបាលកុម្មុយនីសវៀតណាមហ្នឹងវាធ្វើអញ្ចឹងមិនមែនថាអាត្មានិយាយបន្លឺឬក៏ចង់ចន់បន្លិចជនជាតិវៀតណាមទេព្រោះជនជាតិវៀតណាមអត់មានខុសអីទេប៉ុន្តែរដ្ឋាភិបាលវៀតណាមទេកុម្មុយនីសវៀតណាមទេដែលធ្វើមកបាបមកលើគៀបសង្កត់លើសិទ្ធិសេរីភាពបញ្ចេញមតិនៅវៀតណាមគេមានច្បាប់ទេគេមានច្បាប់ថាយើងអាចមានហាស្ដីបានធ្វើបាតកម្មបានប៉ុន្តែដល់ពេលយើងធ្វើបាតកម្មគេចាប់យើងដាក់គុកអានឹងកុម្មុយនីសវៀតណាមគឺអញ្ចឹងឯង
I would like to clarify that as a Khmer Kram indigenous people, I have no hatred or animosity against any Vietnamese population, but I'm against the policy of the government of Vietnam, which oppress everybody, including the Khmer Kram, for practice our freedom of expression, freedom of religion. Everybody was a victim of that oppression, and include the Khmer Kram.
ថ្ងៃទី2ទៀតអាត្មាក៏មិនពេញចិត្តតង់ឡើយនេះរដ្ឋាភិបាលវៀតណាមហ្នឹងដាក់កងអាងហ្នឹងគេហៅណាដាក់កងអាងគីមហ្នឹងទៅគ្រប់វត្តទៅណាមកណាខ្មែរឲ្យទៅលោកទៅណាមកណានេះញាតិញោមដែលធ្លាប់ទៅញាតិញោមធ្លាប់នៅហ្នឹងណាហើយដល់ទៅស្រុកវិញទៅគេតាមដានធាវយកឲ្យរហូតទៅណាឲ្យទៅសូម្បីទៅបន្ទប់ទឹកក៏ទៅតាមដែរគ្រប់ម្ល៉េះអញ្ចឹងទៅយើងពិបាកគ្រោះដែរនេះទី2គេចាត់ទុកថាយើងហ្នឹងដែលមកប្រទេសកៅនេះយើងអស់មានអីជាមួយរដ្ឋាភិបាលទៀតទេណាគេមិនទុកចិត្តយើងគេថាយើងមកប្រទេសកៅហ្នឹងចង់ទៀមទាអញ្ចេះចង់ទៀមទាអញ្ចោះនេះហើយយើងអាងតែយើងនៅប្រទេសកៅតាមពិតទៅយើងនៅប្រទេសកៅយើងធ្លាប់ទៅមកតើមានមកយូរណាស់អញ្ចឹងទៅសូមញាតិញោមជ្រាបរឿងហ្នឹងដឹងស្រាប់ហើយរដ្ឋាភិបាលវៀតណាមហ្នឹងធ្វើមកលើខ្មែរកម្ពុជាក្រមញាតិញោមដែលជាជនជាតិវៀតណាមអត់ដឹងទេប៉ុន្តែដល់ពួកគាត់អាត្មាខ្មែរនេះវាតាមរហូតមកស្វាកំពុងទៅរៀនរឿងបាលីជុំកັບណាមបោវាតាមមិនបាច់ហៅយ៉យដេវចារហូតមិនបាច់ជ្រៀត
For you as a Vietnamese citizen, you have been complaining about the oppression. How about us who are the indigenous and ethnic minority there? The oppression will become like double or triple minority within Vietnam. And as you know that for the outside world, they don't know what's going on. But inside Vietnam, the Vietnamese secret service or intelligence officer follow us every day, intimidate us. So every move we will be monitored. So for the Khmer Kram ethnic who escaped to the United States and third world country, when they go back to visit their family there, they are not free. You know, their authority or their agents intimidate us every move. So it's not safe at all for us, especially Khmer Krom.
ហ្នឹងហើយដូចពីគុណថាធឿនលីវនីហ្នឹងដោយសារលោកមានបជាប្រៃលោកក្មេងតែប៉ុន្តែលោកមានបជាប្រៃលោកទេសនាប្រកែអញ្ចឹងទៅលោកហាត់ក្មេងហាត់អីហ្នឹងហាត់សិស្សទៅក្មេងៗហ្នឹងមកតាមមកវត្តរៀនសខ្មែរច្រើនអញ្ចឹងទៅហើយលោកមានបងប្អូនប្រទេសក្រៅដែលនៅចិត្តផ្ទះលោកហ្នឹងដូចអាត្មាហ្នឹងអញ្ចឹងទៅចាប់បើបែរជាវាយគាត់វាយបែកគាត់ហ្នឹងមកចាប់លោកបោះឡើងឡានចាប់លោកតង់យប់កងសាងហ្នឹងចាប់លោកតង់យប់បោះឡើងឡានយកទៅដាក់គុកតើចង់មួយឆ្នាំណាមិនអោយដឹងឡើងដល់ពេលឡើងតុលាការបានដឹងថានៅឡើយណាចាប់បំបត្តិផោះតាំងថាគេថាបាក់គុក
One of the Khmer Krom Buddhisman named Venerable Livni is Thathun Livni for Buddhisman. Thathun Livni, Thatpumrit, Travantha. This for Buddhist monks. They are famous because they preach very good Buddhism. The people in the village love them. In addition to that, they taught Khmer language in the Buddhist temple. So a lot of young children come to learn Khmer language, which is different from Vietnamese language. So the government authority came to arrest him at night, lock him up in jail for more than a year, and no family know where he will disappear until later on, like more than a year. This is how they treat the people there.
ដូចទឹកលីចិន្តាទៀតនៅវត្តខុសពីថ្មប៉ុន្តែនៅសពមួយគ្នានៅយិនចូលដូចគ្នាហ្នឹងអញ្ចឹងទៅយប់ឡើងហ្នឹងវីធ្វើវីវាយធ្វើទីថាលោកភ័យលោកហាត់ក្មេងដែរអញ្ចឹងទៅលោកភ័យលោកហត់ចូលទៅពួនអញ្ចឹងទៅពួកកងសាងហ្នឹងវាយកកញ្ញោហ្នឹងវាយធ្វើទម្លេវាយអញ្ចឹងចូលហ្មងវាយវត្តចាប់លោកហ្នឹងសាទអោខោបោះឡើងឡានទៅវីឆ្អែតវីនៅក្នុងឡានហ្នឹងដល់ពេលវីក្នុងឡានឆ្អែតទៅវាយកទៅសួរចម្លើយសួរអីហើយសារវាដាក់ទៅជាដាក់នៅក្នុងផ្ទះហ្នឹងមិនអោយទៅណាងោះចាំតែពេលកាត់ទោសយកទៅគុកហេងដែរដោយសារលោកខត់ធ្វើ
One of our Khmer Krom Buddhisman named Lichanda, he was surrounded by probably the police and military authority surrounding his temple, and they crashed the door, arrest him at night, and lock up. They beat him, they flog him, and torture him for no reason. The only reason they taught Khmer language. Yeah, it's a lot of violation that nobody knows.
អាត្មាសូមជម្រាបម្ដងទៀតអាត្មាអត់មានចិត្តអីអាត្មាអ្នកបួសអត់មានចិត្តអីគុំគួនមួយជនជាតិវៀតណាមទេប៉ុន្តែអាត្មាគិតតែមិនពេញចិត្តនឹងរដ្ឋាភិបាលវៀតណាមដែលធ្វើមកលើខ្មែរកម្ពុជាក្រមជាពិសេសចង់បំបត្តិពូជសាសខ្មែរកម្ពុជាក្រមឲ្យคล้ายទៅជាវៀតណាមីស
I would like to clarify again as a Buddhist monk I have no racial discrimination or hatred against any ordinary citizen. I am not happy with against the government communist of Vietnam, which practice their ethnic cleansing policy to wipe out my people, my race, and make us to become Vietnamese by force, by pressure, that which I resisted.
ហើយឥឡូវហ្នឹងឲ្យតែលោកសង្ឃហ្នឹងជួបជុំគ្នាហែលតាម4-5អង្គឡើងហ្នឹងគឺថាកងអាងគេtheo dõiរហូតមិនបាច់ទៅណាទេសូម្បីតែទៅឆាន់ក៏ដោយ
Nowadays in the Mekong Delta any 4 or 5 Buddhist monks who just sit and talk like this for ordinary thing the secret service government secret service will come to investigate intimidate so it's very difficult
កាលអាត្មាហ្នឹងអត់មានដឹងអីវាចាប់ទៅវាយយករដ្ឋាភិបាលវៀតណាមវាយយើងខ្លាំងណាស់ចាប់ទៅភ្លាមពេលដែលចាហ្នឹងវាយយើងអត់ដឹងជួនណាចាស់ឆ្នាំយើងមិនដឹងខ្លួនវាយយើងតត់យើងធាក់យើងគ្រប់សពបែបយ៉ាងរដ្ឋាភិបាលវៀតណាមគឺមិនមែនថាថ្មមួយមិនពេញចិត្តទេដោយសាររដ្ឋាភិបាលវៀតណាមហ្នឹងធ្វើមកលើលោកខ្មែរហ្នឹងខ្លាំងពេកធ្វើមកលើជនជាតិខ្មែរក្រមហ្នឹងខ្លាំងពេកសូមញាតិញោមកុំអន់ចិត្តដោយសារអាត្មានិយាយឈ្មោះវៀតណាមដដែល
please do not disappointed when I repeatedly mention about the word Vietnam. That's not my hatred against Vietnam, but from my personal experience, who have been arrested, imprisoned, beaten, tortured during that time, I have the right to tell you that how bad the communists treat every people, including our ethnic indigenous people.
ហើយដោយសាររដ្ឋាភិបាលវៀតណាមចាត់ទុកថាយើងប្រទេសកៅហ្នឹងកាលមិនគេមិនហៅយើងថាយកគៀវផាងដងហ៎អរេដល់ឡូវយកគៀវអ៊ីវnướcដោយសារយើងមានលុយច្រើនទី2ទៀតរដ្ឋាភិបាលវៀតណាមចាត់ទុកយើងមិនដែលទុកចិត្តយើងទេយើងមកប្រទេសកៅហ្នឹងអូយតែយើងជិញផិត24ម៉ោងគឺគេតាមដានគេtheo dõiដល់ផ្ទះយើងដល់ភូមិយើងអញ្ចឹងទៅគេមិនដែលទុកចិត្តយើងថាយើងជាប្រជាជនល្អទេអញ្ចឹងទៅតើណាយើងទៅហ្នឹងញាតិញោមទៅដឹងញាតិញោមខ្លះទៅសบายពេកមិនដឹងថាគេតាមដានពីក្រោយគេតាមtheo dõiពីក្រោយរហូតហ្នឹងគេមិនដែលទុកចិត្តយើងទេ
For us who escape to the free world country to go back to see our family in our hometown was such a joy. But we didn't know that every step that we landed in Vietnam, we were being followed. They investigate our family member there. So there's no joy at all. We went there just like bring more trouble to our family, including ourselves.
នឹងអាត្មាភាពគាត់ណាមានប៉ុណ្្នឹងហើយនឹងក៏สนុំពរញាតិញោមដែលមានបងប្អូនធ្វើកម្មអភិបាលហ្នឹងទៅបាបឲ្យដឹងកុំឲ្យធ្វើបាបធ្វើទុកមកលើបងប្អូនខ្មែរកម្ពុជាក្រមពេកព្រោះយើងជាប្រជាជនដូចគ្នាយើងចង់ឃើញមានការកាប់ចាស់គ្នាទេយើងសម័យនេះហើយចង់ទៅណាមកណាជិះឡានទៅណាមកណាហឺហាសបាយយើងមិនចង់អោយទីថាមួយថ្ងៃគាត់ថាគុំគួនគ្នាចង់តែកាប់គ្នាសម្លាប់គ្នាហើយtheo dõiគ្នាទៅវិញទៅមកអានឹងមិនល្អទេអានឹងទៅមិនឃើញ IC ទេអាកគ្នាធ្វើបាបគ្នាទៅវិញទៅមកមនុស្សជាតិហ្នឹងគឺវាមិនល្អទេយើងសិតតែអ្នកកាន់ពុទ្ធសាសនាណាអ្នកខ្លះកាន់គ្រីស្ទៀនក៏ដោយអ្នកខ្លះកាន់ព្រះពុទ្ធក៏ដោយក៏សិតតែចង់រស់ល្អអស់គ្នាយើងមិនចង់មានការកាប់ចាស់សម្លាប់គ្នាទេព្រោះ
I would like to honestly convey my message to all of you who might have some family member working in the government authority there to let them know that please don't oppress us. We just want to live in peace, just like everybody else, without being arrested or do anything. We part of Vietnam too. We one of the 54 ethnic there. So we want to live in peace, but freedom to practice our religion. That's it.
ហើយជាងអាត្មាក៏សូមអរគុណញាតិញោមទាំងអស់គ្នាដែលបានស្ដាប់រឿងអាត្មាហើយសូមជូនពរញាតិញោមទាំងអស់គ្នាបានសុខសប្បាយរហូត
I appreciate for your attention to listen to my speech. Again, my name is Shea. I'm the Vice President of the Khmer Kampuchea Krong Federation, a non-profit organization which represents my people all over the world. We advocate human rights awareness among the international public, freedom of speech and freedom of human rights and religious freedom. As you all aware, I see all your age, you probably were in Vietnam during the U.S. involvement in the 60s and the early 70s before American troop withdrawal. In Vietnam, they divided geographic area there into 4 zones. Military corps, first corps, second corps, third corps, and fourth corps. From Khe Sanh, Quang Tri way all the way to the Mekong Delta in Kamal province. My people live in the military fourth corps, the Mekong Delta, the very fertile land. The vital lifeline of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops during the war based heavily upon 2 strategic locations. The Mekong Delta, which is in the 4th Corps, and also the military 3rd Corps, Central Highland, the encompassed area between Ban Mi Thuot, the sanctuary border of Cambodia, where the Viet Cong, North Vietnamese troops, American troops called VC and VA, stay inside Cambodia, and also the southern Laos. They call the triangle border. The triangle border and the third corps is the Ho Chi Minh supply line. So they depend on these both areas, food and military equipment or supply line. The food, they don't need to import food from Hanoi. So they rely on the rice crop in the Mekong Delta, very best land. So they feed themselves over there. My people live over there. We under two military, just like the mafia in New York. During daytime, they under the U.S. by South Vietnamese government authority, including the American troops to oversee. But at night, when the dark, the Viet Cong and the NVA came back. So we are very difficult to live between the borderline. This is the fourth corps. So for us to survive, we have to choose. Majority of choose side. We choose on the good guy, American troops. So we volunteer to work for the U.S. 9th Infantry Division, which operate in the Mekong Delta. Also work under South Vietnamese government. But all the Khmer Krom, they joined the U.S. Special Forces on the third corps, sent on the operation along Ho Chi Minh Trail. They call cross-border operation. Back to the Mekong Delta, several million of my people, which consist the largest majority of ethnic people in Vietnam, besides the Vietnamese people, we practice Theravada Buddhism, which is different from the Vietnamese population, which is Mahayana Buddhism. Of course, Buddhism just like Catholic and Protestant. Second thing, our community, our village cluster, we have 500 Buddhist temples all over the Mekong Delta. Each temple was surrounded by 8 or 10 small villages, a Khmer Krom population. The two need each other. The Buddhist temple, which the Buddhist monks stay there, they provide counsel or advice to the population, just like married, the funeral. When you have dispute among the people, the monk come in to solve it. We don't need the judge. We solve our problem. Also teach Khmer language to the young children so they can learn Khmer language, so they become a Buddhist monk, which is so proud to be a Buddhist monk there to practice. They have to learn Khmer script. Also to maintain our culture, our identity, the Khmer Krom culture, tradition, everything surrounding the temple. The temple is the center of tradition, culture, and everything, language. Surrounding the temple, about 5, 6, 7, or 8, 9 villages are the farmers, Khmer Krom farmers. Because we live in the Delta, fertile land, we are the rice producer. During the Saigon government, supported by the U.S., by Washington, our living standard was good. We have enough food to eat. We have freedom. But after the fall of Saigon, everything just like 360-degree reversal. We become starving, no food to eat. Vietnam, when you look to the north, they don't have enough land to produce rice. But when they control the south, right now they become the world #1 rice exporter, surpass Thailand. I have no problem with Vietnam being a #1 rice exporter, but it's not fair to my people who live in that land, have no food to eat. Put yourself in my people's shoes, how you feel. This is not racial discrimination, that's about survival. A nation to have no food, the land grabbing policy which apply to everybody, because land becomes so precious in the Delta. They took the land from our people. Without land, farmers have no life. This is the so-called man-made disaster. Human rights violation. They torture our people. Buddhist monks, we should respect them. They beat the monk, they frog, throw them in jail just like pigs. How you feel as us, And we are not maybe ethnic minority there, indigenous. Nobody knows. Another thing, they have the indirect ethnic cleansing policy of forcing us by making us starving, lose our land and grab our land. We have to migrate to the urban area like Ho Chi Minh City or Saigon or any place to find a labor job to do below minimum wage. It's not enough. So we lose our land, lose our culture, lose our language. The temple, including Buddhism, we rely heavily on the support from the rice farmer. Without the farmer, the temple becomes deteriorated. That affects the religion. This is not about hatred against Vietnamese, but the policy from the communist government of Vietnam make us so hard to live. I mentioned to you about the man-made disaster. How about the natural disaster? Only God can stop it. The climate change, which we have concern about the Paris, talk about global warming. The climate change affects everybody from Southern California to Southern Vietnam. Right now, there's severe drought, lack of rainfall. Farmer need rains. Without rain, right now the land will be very dry. We become starving. We move to the urban area, we lose that. In addition to that, the rising of sea water, the melted of ice in North Pole or South Pole because of warm climate, make the sea water rise. It flood the lower land, that means the Mekong Delta, we live there. So we have to move up. In the next 10, 20 years, we don't know how much the salted water will destroy the farmland. This is very critical. And so, what can we do? We depend heavily on the superpower, which is the United States. My people shed our blood, sacrifice a lot of blood and tears to work side by side, voluntarily, wholeheartedly for the U.S. troops, especially the Green Beret, the U.S. Special Forces, on many special operations, civilian irregular defense group, CIDG. It's okay for President Barack Obama and all the previous administrations, including President Bill Clinton, to normalize relationship with Vietnam. America is the best. We fought in World War II against Japan and Germany. After the end of the war, we forgive and forget, rebuild that country, become one of the best. As a Khmer Kram people, I have no problem for United States to repeat the same thing to Vietnam, just like they did to Germany and Japan in World War II. But don't forget, you can forgive and forget Vietnam. I don't mean the ordinary people, but the communist government of Vietnam. I open this. But the Vietnamese government of Vietnam now forgive and forget the little people like our people, the Montagnard in Central Highland, the Hmong Hill tribes in Laos, who work side by side for the American troops, expecting American will now cut and run, abandon us. You know, if we were slaughtered after the fall of Saigon, nobody knows. After that, we escaped. There was a lot of obstacles. So, through all of you, through the American authority, I speak from my heart. I would like the Hudson Institute, the State Department, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, Tina, I met her in Dili, East Timor, in early August. I speak the same thing. I spoke the same thing. It's good for United States to balance the Asia pivot in South Asia, the South Chinese, whatever, you know, the sea line communication. That's not my problem. That's not my people's problem. My people have nothing to do against the United States government or against the communist government of Vietnam. We just care to have our food in our mouth, also to have freedom to speak, to practice our Buddhism. Very simple, very little. Why the United States government overlook that appeal? You forget, you waive Vietnam from the economic sanction or the country of particular concern, the blacklist. At this point, everybody, including ourselves, you know, we believe in the United States. If United States want to remain the only superpower, fair and firm, just like U.S. Supreme Court, You have to be truthful to your language. You speak in one thing, you practice different thing. You want us to believe in you, but you veil the human rights violation in Vietnam. You go there and shake hands with Vietnam, concerned about your interest against China. That's your problem. But for us, we were tortured every day. Catholic, Vaha, Cao Dai, Buddhist. You know, this is just simple thing. Please ask the Vietnamese government to forgive and forget us too, just like you do to Vietnam. Forgive, forget. Lift economic sanctions, sell sophisticated weapons to Vietnam. We just need to live in peace in our motherland. Just have rights to eat. I appreciate the Hudson Institute Center for Religious Freedom for giving me the opportunity to come here. I know in a short time. And I appreciate to all of you for listening to my speech. Appreciate, thank you.
This is the end, this closes the second panel, but I just wanted to say thank you so much to all our speakers. I think your message you've given today is really so important because, as you said, it's not the problem of the Vietnamese people. The Vietnamese government, the communist government, is trying to put divisions between religions, to put Buddhism against the Catholics against the Protestants, and to divide to rule. And we won't let them do that. We're here to speak as one voice because religious freedom means the respect for every individual and for every belief. We have our own beliefs, but we respect the beliefs of others. That's the basis of democracy, and it's the basis of religious freedom. So I just wanted to say, Nina, Shea, you're here. The Hudson Institute has done a wonderful thing today to open your doors and to hear all these messages. And I just want to say that it's so important because Pennsylvania Avenue, we're 3 blocks away from the White House. We're very near to Congress. The president, he's here. They're going to hear your voices. The things you've said today are going to be heard in Congress. They're going to be heard in the White House, thanks to Hudson, but also thanks to the courage of all of you to keep the fight going. So this closes this panel for the moment. We're going to have a short break. Well, probably not a break, but if anybody needs to go to have a drink or something, a little rest. But then we're going to continue for a discussion where you can all take part, and we'd like to hear the views of all of you and the questions. So thank you very much, Nina.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to the second panel. You were all wonderful. And thank you all for coming. Again, it was my great honor to partner with Vo Van Ai and Penelope and the Vietnam Committee for Human Rights and Religious Freedom. Thank you all for coming. We will, this whole program up until now is going to be linked on our website if you want to share it or spread the word. You can link to it. So I'll send it out to Penelope, and you can spread it around your network.
Wonderful.
Okay, great. Thank you all. It's a great privilege for me.
Thank you. Could I just have one last word to say thanks to our interpreter who's been working non-stop for how many? Almost 3 hours. So thank you very much. Thanks to your interpreting, everybody's been able to follow today's discussion. Thank you very much.